All right, the book of Job. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. We're going to start talking a little bit about the history behind this, the dating, and then we'll get into it. Job 1:1. There was a man in the land of Uz, or Uz, I don't know, whose name was Job. And that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. And 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. Also, his possessions were 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys, and a very large household. So that this man was the greatest of all the people of the east. And his sons would go and feast in their houses, each on his appointed day, and would send and invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. So it was, when the days of feasting had run their course, that Job would send and sanctify them. And he would rise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, "It may be that my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts." Thus Job did regularly. All right, so the book of Job begins by introducing the central character here. Perhaps this was written by Job himself to record his own experiences. But it begins, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job. Commentary says that the book of Job is rightly understood to be a masterpiece of Hebrew poetry and Western literature as the first poetic book of the English Bible. Job introduces the reader to the idea of Hebrew poetry, which involves repetition and combination of ideas more than sounds. The author, date, and place of the book of Job are all uncertain. It may be that Job himself recorded his experiences in the book, or there may well have been another anonymous author. Judging by the style of the Hebrew it uses, some scholars judge Job to be the oldest book of the Old Testament. Ancient is beyond all dispute. It probably belongs to the period covered by the book of Genesis and possibly to the time of Abraham. Its lesson, therefore, is the oldest lesson that we could have. The text of Job is so ancient that in some places we don't really know the exact meaning of some of the words, yet the general meaning is clear. For an example, Job 6:6. The disgust expressed in Job's remark that rear himlet is tasteless can be appreciated, even though we still do not know what the substance is. We know what we can appreciate that it's the meaning of it. It's fascinating to think that as we open this text, we may be faced with the earliest of all written accounts of human beings' relationship with Yahweh, the one true God. The book of Job is not primarily about one man's suffering and his pain that he's going through. Job's problem is not so much financial or social or medical. His central problem is theological. Job must deal with the fact that in his life God does not act the way he always thought God would and should act. In this drama, the book of Job is not so much a record of solutions and explanations to this problem. It's more of a revelation of Job's experience and answers carried within his experience. We see here Job, the man was blameless, he was upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. The first look at him, we see that he's exceedingly a good person. He's a righteous man. The author here is giving an impressive description of a man who was not perfect, but certainly complete in his devotion, respect, and obedience to God. Job's connection with God seems to be independent of any other Old Testament character. He definitely seems to have lived before the time of Moses and the people of Israel, perhaps even before Abraham. Some believe that Jobab, mentioned in Genesis 10:29, is Job, which would put him in the era between Noah and Abraham. If that was the era of Job, then we can say that Job's deep and true relationship with God was no doubt passed on to him from his ancestors, dating back to the time of Noah and his son. In this respect, he was somewhat like Melchizedek, as in Genesis 14, who simply appeared on the scene as someone who was a worshiper and follower of the true God. Now, staying on the topic of the dating of this book, others point to several reasons for dating Job later on. perhaps in the generations after Jacob and Esau. Uz was Abraham's nephew, the son of his brother, in Genesis 22:21. The land of Uz may be named after him. Eliphaz in Job 2:11 was the son of Esau in Genesis 34:10. This son of Esau had a son named Teman, Genesis 36, and the descendants of Teman were known for the wisdom in Jeremiah 49. Bildad was called a Shuhite in Job 2:11, and Shua was the son of Abraham through Keturah, Genesis 35:2. So, in retrospect, they don't know exactly the date of this text that we're going to be going through. It could be, it could be any of these options. I don't know what your Bibles say based off of that, but point is, nobody knows for sure. When it says Job was blameless, this does not mean that Job was sinless. Okay? But blameless. There's a huge difference here. As Job lived before the watchful eye of his peers, no one could justly charge Job with moral failure. His reputation was impeccable. He was a blameless man. Nobody could come up to him and say, accuse him of this, or this, or that. They couldn't do it. That doesn't mean he wasn't sinless, though. The insistence on Job's uprightness should not be weakened in the interest of a dogma or universal human depravity. Job is not considered to be perfect or sinless. All the speakers in the book, including Job himself, are convinced that men are sinful. Job's first recorded act is to what? Offer sacrifices for sin, for his children. It goes on to describe 7 sons and 3 daughters were born to him. His possessions were 7,000 sheep. In a culture where status and wealth might be measured by the size of one's family, we see that Job was a man of impressive wealth and status. By any measure, Job was a prominent and affluent man. His godliness, wealth, and status made it true that this man was the greatest of all the people of the East, just as Scripture says. Much later in the book, we will actually catch a glimpse of what Job actually did with his money, with his position, with his authority. We see that how he handled all his wealth. His time and his energy. He rescued the needy. He cared personally for the handicapped and the dying. He brought orphans into his home. He even took the power of barons of his day to court and argued the case for the underprivileged. And we'll see that. Also in this text, in the verses that we read, it says that his sons would go and feast in the houses each on his appointed day. The idea of this description seems to be that Job's family had a happy and close relationship. This reinforces the idea that Job and his family were greatly blessed and does not seem to indicate that they were unduly given over to festivity and pleasure-seeking. They happily celebrated special days, each on his appointed day. If he had condemned it, he would never have offered sacrifice to God, lest they should have sinned. But he would have told them at once it was a sinful thing, and he would give no countenance to it. It's Charles Spurgeon. Spurgeon saw in Job 1, verses 4 through 5, a permission for feasting and celebration among believers. He preached a Christmas sermon upon this very text and used it as proof that God allows and enjoys such celebrations among his people. We see that Job would send and sanctify them. He would arise early in the morning and offer burnt offerings. Again, this idea seems to suggest that Job was a godly man. who served as a priest to his family. More than his children were wicked people who needed constant atonement. This is a great example for parents, godly parents who lovingly watch over their children. We see that Job is very concerned about his kids' sin life. He's offering burnt offerings for them. On Job 1:5, we see curse God in their hearts. We see that phrase. The word chala, to curse, stood originally in the primitive text, but out of a dislike to utter with the lips such an expression as curse God, they put it in its stead barak, to bless, relegating the original word kala, to curse, to the notes and placed on record the fact of their alteration, thus protecting the original primitive text. So we see little variations in text sometimes. This is an old book, so we're going to see this occasionally, where they'll change meaning of a word around. And the last commentary I have on this, it says, one would not know it from the first few verses, but the book of Job is about an epic war. Yet no city is attacked or besieged or conquered, no battles are won or lost, no oceans are sailed or nations founded or adventurers recorded. The whole conflict happens on an ash heap, virtually a garbage dump outside of a village. It is an epic war, but one of the inner life, a struggle to make sense of some of the deepest questions of life. Is there any questions or comments on any of that before we begin? Everybody's familiar with the book of Job, right? Okay. All right, so verse 6, we're going to see that the scene is going to change. The stage is going to be set in heaven here in verse 6 or 12. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. And the Lord said to Satan, from where do you come? So Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro on the earth, and from walking back and forth on it. Then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and shuns evil? So Satan answered the Lord and said, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not made a hedge around him, around his household, and around all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. But now stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only do not lay a hand on his person. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. It says, now there was a day. This reveals a scene in heaven. This is, of course, it's unseen to Job and all the other inhabitants of the earth, but absolutely real nonetheless. Remember, this is a literal translation. We're reading Scripture literally. The story of Job can really only be properly understood by taking into account what happened in heaven and by having more than an earthly perspective. Without this prologue, the Job of the dialogues and monologues might just be considered a man with an insufferable self-righteousness, and the reader would be left without a heavenly perspective. People will always argue that the book of Job, the scenes that I just read, is just speculative of the writer. They're taking artistic interpretation to a different level, but that's not the case. We're reading Scripture literally. This happened. And it puts everything else into perspective. When the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, the phrase the sons of God is used in the Old Testament to describe angelic beings. We see that in Genesis 6 and Job 38. Among this group of angelic beings, Satan also came among them. The fact that Satan came among them shows that Satan is himself an angelic being and in no way equal to God. We often, to his great delight, inflate Satan's status and importance, thinking of him as the opposite of God, as if God were light and Satan were darkness, as if God were hot and Satan were cold. Satan wishes he was the opposite of God, but God wants us to know that Satan is a mere creature and is in no way the opposite of God. If Satan has an opposite, it is not God the Father or God the Son. It would be a high-ranking angelic being such as Michael. Again, perspective of Satan, I think we all understood that. A lot of people put Satan as the opposite of God, that he's equal to God. A lot of religions, I know Mormonism, I think Satan is the brother of Jesus, but that's not true. None of that's true. The fact that they came to present themselves before the Lord shows that angelic beings, indeed fallen angelic beings, have access to the presence of God. We see that in 1 Kings 22, Zechariah 3, but one day they will be restricted to the earth, as in Revelation 12. God says, "From where do you come?" God allowed, and he continues to allow, Satan and fallen angelic beings into his presence, but only for his own purposes. Therefore, he demanded to know what Satan's business was. Satan answers, "From going to and fro on the earth." Though Satan has access to heaven, he also has free access to the earth and roams about the earth as a roaring lion. We see that in 1 Peter 5:8. It can be said that Satan has an active interest in what happens on the earth. And God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" It was God who brought up Job as a subject for discussion. And God brought up Job in the sense of bragging of Job's godliness and character. God was so impressed with Job that he affirmed the description of Job as first recorded in Job 1:1. Of course, Satan does consider the saints of God, yet what does the devil see when he considers the saints? He sees them and is amazed at the difference between himself and God's people. He sees us and knows that though he has fallen, these earthen creatures still stand. He sees them and is amazed at their happiness. He knows too well the misery of his own soul, but he admires and hates the peace in the soul of the believer. He sees him and looks for some fault, so that he may find some small comfort in his own black soul and hypocrisy. He sees him especially great hearts among the saints. He sees those who block and hinder his foul work. He sees them and looks for opportunity to do them harm. Is there any questions or comments so far on this? We're all in agreement that this really happened, right? Is there any doubt among anybody? Okay.
But when God asked Satan where had he been, he already knew that.
He knew that. He knew that. God, as we know the characteristics of God, he knows everything in all places at all times. He knew. Any other questions? Let's go back to that text. There is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, one who fears God and shuns evil. This was God's pronouncement of Job's character. After these first two chapters of Job, almost everything we know of the man is colored by the perspective of the speaker. Later, when Job talks about himself and his situation, we must take into account that it is Job who speaks. When his friends speak likewise, they speak according to their knowledge, their ignorance, and bias. Only in the first two chapters do we have a truly objective viewpoint about Job. He really was a blameless, upright man, no matter what his friends would later say. Because who's speaking that? Who's saying that? God. However, it's important to point out, we know, and God knows, Job knows, that he is not sinless. He's not sinless. He's not perfect. But yet God called him blameless.
But that's what we're supposed to be too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like a pastor, that's one of the descriptions in Timothy.
Mm-hmm.
To be blameless.
Yeah, absolutely. That's how we're going to conduct our life. But we're not sinless. We see Satan fulfilling the role described in Revelation 12. Does Job fear God for nothing? The accuser of the brethren. Satan accused Job before God, insisting that Job's godliness was essentially false and that Job only served God for what he could get from him. The accuser of the brethren. Satan's reply to God first reveals his essential cynicism. He doubts every supposed good as being dishonest and hollow. Cynicism is the essence of the satanic, that Satan believes nothing to be genuinely good, neither Job or his disinterested piety, nor God in his disinterested generosity. The accusation against Job was also an accusation against God, for it implied that God had bribed Job into obedience. I myself, he seems to say, could be as pious as Job, or I as prosperous as he. You see how he's framing the argument here?
Could you go, when you get a break, go back up to verse 6 about the angels? One day the angels came to present themselves to the Lord, and Satan also. So that was Satan's angels? Verse 6. Can you give some insight as to the angels that came?
Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them.
Yeah, well, mine says, one day the angels came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. And that's when the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? So, and he says, I've been roaming the earth and everything. Were these angels roaming the earth with Satan?
The fallen all angels, what we... I'm trying to look.
The fallen angels?
Yeah, fallen angels absolutely are on the earth as well. But so are the non-fallen angels.
I don't take this to mean that they're Satan's angels. I think they're just.
I know MacArthur, he says, like a Judas among the apostles, Satan was with the angels.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, mine says the angelic host came to God's throne to render account of their ministry throughout the earth and heaven. So he was probably asking the angels what they had been doing as well, and Satan had to take account of it also.
Yeah. I'm trying to... You remember that dream? Well, mine's wandering right now. The dream with the ladder? Jacob, yeah. With where he's seen the angels from heaven descending and ascending. So yeah, the angels, both the non-fallen and the fallen, are present here on the earth.
But are sons of God the term used for angels ever used for fallen angels, or is it always used for specifically?
I want to say in Genesis 6, did they not use that term? I believe they did use that term in Genesis 6, where they were talking about the sons of God going into women, producing the Nephilim or something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the term is used quite often in Scripture, but in this context, I believe that it was the angels and Satan was allowed to come within the presence of the Lord, just for this circumstance to happen. Does that answer your question, or? Yeah, kind of. Satan's accusation gave testimony to the fact that God had protected Job. Have you not made a hedge around him, and had also blessed him? You have blessed. Jesus indicated from Luke 22 that Satan wanted to do much worse against Peter than God allowed him to do because of a similar hedge of protection. So what do we learn from here is that God does protect his people. He puts up a hedge around them. But he could remove that hedge, as we see in this story. Satan says, "But now stretch out your hand." His language is abrupt. He commands God with imperative verbs, literally, "By now you have just extended your hand and but now you just extend your hand and damage all his property." We see here in Satan that he's confident in his accusations against Job. Satan is insisting to God that Job would surely curse you to your face if this protection and blessing was withdrawn. Satan believed that the adversity could make Job move from his standing in faith, that Job would be unable to stand against the wiles and the deceptions of the devil, as is given to the believer in Ephesians 6:13. God says, "Behold, all that he has is in your power, only do not lay a hand on his person." In response to Satan's accusation, God gives him great, though limited, power and permission to attack Job. God would not let down the hedge without completely removing it. So Satan had the power and desire to afflict Job all along. What he lacked was the allowance from God. When God allowed it, Satan was more than happy to attack Job up to the limit of that allowance. Again, we're learning something about Satan here. He's not, as a lot of people believe, all-powerful. He's not all-knowing. He's not God. He's a created being.
And he tries to make himself like God again, and like saying that he knows what Job is thinking, like truly, but obviously only God knows the thoughts and intents of the heart. So Satan's saying, well, I know what he's really thinking. He's going to curse you to your face, but obviously God knows that's not going to happen because he knows Job's true character. But it's interesting how Satan tries to make himself like God in this instance.
Yeah. Absolutely. Anything else? Anybody else? All right, so what's God's end in this? Is it gratifying the devil? Some people argue that why is this happening? Why is God allowing Satan to have all this authority? It doesn't make sense. Ultimately, as we're going to read and as we're going to find out, it's going to glorify God in the end. This is going to tremendously glorify God. We see that Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. As he did, he continued a sequence of events in the spiritual realm that is in Ephesians 6:12 are real but not immediately apparent to Job as having their origin in spiritual battle. The commentator says this, that the revelation of the heavenly scene behind the earthly scene helps us to understand the later comment of James on Job. As in James 5:11, indeed we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. The two great themes in the book of Job, as explained by James, are the perseverance of Job and the end intended by the Lord. And it's important that we learn both themes. The end intended by the Lord, as in again James 5:11, connects with God's eternal purposes as revealed in Ephesians 3:10-11. That God intends that now the manifold wisdom of God might be made known by the church to the principalities and powers in the heavenly places, according to the eternal purpose. God used Job to teach angelic beings, especially to teach them about his own spectacular wisdom. Therefore, the book of Job teaches us that there is an aspect of human misery that is not the penalty for sin. And this is a big deal right here, because a lot of people will look upon afflictions, whatever afflictions he might be born with, even back in Jesus' time, they looked at that as consequences of sin. It's the consequences of the sins of the mother, the father, sometimes in that individual's life. Maybe they became blind later on in life, but the consequences for sin. Again, therefore, the book of Job teaches us that there is an aspect of human misery that is not the penalty for sin, not correction and righteousness, not redemptive in itself, and not the noble bearing for persecution for righteousness' sake. Job's suffering was of this aspect. We might say that the reason for his suffering was as a tool to teach angelic beings. Job made known the manifold wisdom of God, the principalities and powers in heavenly places. The man who suffers as a penalty of sin can, by the way he receives the suffering, be an important lesson of God's wisdom. Yet Job's case was unique. His suffering seems to be mainly or only concerned with this purpose of instructing angelic beings. In that process, God used Satan himself, even as he went out from the presence of the Lord in all his evil designs. Satan may intend one thing, but God uses him for another. In all these things, he is a minister used for the ultimate blessing, comfort, and help of the people of God, and for the present spiritual profit. He was allowed to be the author of Job's trials and losses, but all his labor was wasted. All of his labor was wasted. For it ended in Job's receiving a double blessing for time and for earth and the righteousness of God forever and ever. Spurgeon said this, as good as Job was at the beginning of the book, he will be a better man at the end of it. He was better in character, he was more humble and more blessed than before. Foolish devil, he is piling up on a pedestal on which God will set his servant Job, that he may be looked upon with wonder by all ages. Oh, how many saints have been comforted in their distress by this history of patience. How many have been saved by the jaw of the lion, and from the paw of the bear, by the dark experiences of the patriarch of Luz. O arch fiend, how art thou taken in thine own net? Thou hast thrown the stone which has fallen on thine own hand. Thou madest a pit for Job, and hast fallen into it itself. Thou art taken in thine own craftiness. And that's Charles Spurgeon. Any questions or comments on that?
You wonder how do the name it and claim it people and the prosperity people get, I guess they don't read the book of Job.
Yeah, they skip over that. They don't have time for that. There's a lot of religions out there that would just, they skip over stuff because they can't answer it. An example with the Jewish synagogues, when they read from the book of Isaiah, they skip over Isaiah 53 every time because they can't answer those questions that are going to come up. And they do the same thing here. They've got to know what they're doing is wrong if they're being honest with themselves. And we all know what's about to happen to Job. We all know that he's about to go through it, what he's about to go through. If you put yourself in his shoes, how would you handle that? I mean, this is devastating stuff. You get a speeding ticket on your way home today after church, and you're upset about it, but put it in perspective. Any other questions or comments before we continue? All right, verse 13. Now there was a day when his sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the oldest brother's house, and a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys feeding besides them, when the Sabeans raided them and took them away. Indeed, they have killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, the Chaldeans formed 3 bands, raided the camels and took them away, yes, and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. While he was still speaking, another also came and said, your sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in your oldest brother's house, and suddenly a great wind came up across the wilderness and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it fell on the young people, and they are dead, and I alone have escaped to tell you. Put that into perspective. Put that into perspective. When you get bad news, it's bad news. Before that bad news is even being told to you, you get more bad news. More bad news. More bad news. And it just seems like it's getting worse and worse and worse. That's devastating. That's devastating. I don't know how you guys would handle that. I'd be a raving lunatic. That happened to me.
But you think about in Corinthians where it talks about God will not give you anything more than no temptation.
Yeah.
More than, I mean, you just think of Job, how strong he was in his faith.
Absolutely.
He was able to withstand all.
Again, that just goes on to the character of who Job is. The guy is a strong wall. Giving greater allowance to afflict Job, Satan maximized his work against the man of God by bringing the catastrophe to Job in the span of a few hours. In that limited time, Job lost his oxen, his servants, his sheep, his camels, and his sons and daughters. What's that say? He lost his family. He lost his wealth. He lost his status. He's a ruined man. This shows us that Satan was focused on maximizing his advantage. If he were allowed to attack Job, he would do it with the most effective way possible, all the way up to what God will allow. Therefore, any foothold we give to Satan is dangerous. We should expect that he will maximize any advantage given to him. When his sons and daughters were eating and drinking, this shows us the great cruelty of Satan. Satan is here revealed in a startling light. His malice is seen in the choice of time he strikes in the midst of festivity.
You think about that when it says, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and he immediately...
Oh, he went to work.
I mean, the hedge was down, but you just think of the protection that we have. The hedge that he has put around us. I mean, he would do the same thing to us. I mean, he still today seeks like a roaring lion to whoever he can devour.
Yeah.
So I just word of praise, thanks to the Lord for his hedge around.
Absolutely. This is years ago, I seen a video of a Satanist, or I forget exactly what he called himself, like a warlock or something, I don't know. But he became a Christian, and he was talking about, they were interviewing him, and he was talking about his time when he was a Satanist. And I remember, I think he was from Brooklyn or something, but he was saying that he was the highest ranking cultic member in Brooklyn. People came to him. He made a lot of money to curse people and go after families and all that. And he said the first time he ever met a Christian, somebody told him to curse this Christian. He said he seemed to hedge around the Christian. He couldn't do anything. And it affected him so much that then he started, basically, make a long story short, that's what seemed that hearing the gospel led him to Christ later on down the road. But he described seeing that he couldn't do anything. What he could do, he had a lot of power over a lot of stuff, but he said, and this is a guy I know, but it was an interesting little interview. But we also hear that there's a tribe. I remember there's a missionary, him and his wife, to this land. His wife was killed. He had to sleep on the grave of his wife, so he was afraid the tribes would come dig up the wife, and because they were cannibals. But later on, those tribes came to Christ, and they spoke of they would attack. They would think about attacking the Christians, but they would see soldiers among those Christians in those early missionary times, and that's described as there was a hedge of protection there. So I guess that there is, to answer your question, there is a strong hedge of protection around God's children. And there's examples, like I just said, that it does happen. Any other questions or comments on that? Again, the Sabines, the fire of God fell from heaven, the Chaldeans, a great wind. The tragedies came to Job from many different causes, yet we know that the prior cause was the instigation of Satan here. He used a lot of means and ways to get what the results that he wanted. In this, we learn something of how Satan works. He did not force godly Sabines and Chaldeans to do things against Job that they did not want to do. He accomplished his evil purpose by working through the evil character of fallen men. We also learned that in some way Satan has some influence over the weather, a great wind, for example, and could imitate a phenomenon usually associated with God, the fire of God from heaven. The servants of Job thought that God sent this fire, that he was only true in the very indirect sense, in the sense that God had allowed it by removing a prior restriction. This shows that at least that sometimes Satan wants to work in such a way that what he does will ultimately be blamed on God, because we see that here in this case. Fire was sent from God, but we know that's not the case. Steve Lawson said that we can only conclude that Satan swings great power over the weather, not all power over all weather, but some power over some weather, to the extent that God allows. The devil has supernatural power at his disposal to direct the elements to accomplish his evil purposes. We also see from this attack that clearly, this is clearly focused against Job. Others have suffered because Satan attacked Job, and God allowed him to be attacked. Job's animals, servants, and children all perished because Job was the target. This can only be justified if we understand this. In allowing their lives to be ended, God did not allow these people to pass from a mortal state to a mortal state. Each of these unfortunates was born mortal and subject to death. The only surprise in their death was that they died sooner than expected, not that they died at all. The rightness or wrongness of what God either allows or actually does can only be finally judged by the measure of eternity, not the measure of this life. We can only say that God either did right or wrong by these unfortunates, by the eternal picture. Until then, we trust what Abraham knew of God, shall not the judge of all the earth do right. A lot of times we'll read stuff in Scripture and we'll think to ourselves, how can this possibly be? How can God allow this? That's because we're not looking at it. We're looking at it from our own earthly flesh. We're looking at the immediate. We're not thinking about eternal stuff. We're putting out character of what God is, what sin is, the consequences of that. If we look at stuff using Scripture, understanding what sin is, understanding the fallen state of man, then we can see that it's just. Is there any questions or comments on any of that? Well, let's see how Job reacts to his losses. Verse 20, then Job arose, tore his robe, shaved his head, and he fell to the ground and worshipped, and he said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this, Job did not sin, nor charge God with wrong. Job arose, he tore his robe, shaved his head. This is how in that time period people went through mourning, through distress. We see sometimes that people will put on sackcloth. They'll roll around in the dust and the dirt. This is how they would present themselves that they're in great distress. Shaving the head, I know that's a fashion statement. You look really good with a shaved head, but in this case, this is not why he did that. Job's mourning his tremendous losses. He had lost his sons, his daughters, and servants, and a great amount of material wealth. It was a time for mourning. We can understand why he's going through this. Job's mourning, but he did not mourn as the heathens or the pagans mourn. He did not cut or gash or tattoo himself for the dead, as was the common practice among those ancient peoples. And we see that in Leviticus 19. Different societies handled mourning differently. He fell to the ground and he worshipped. In the midst of this mourning, Job also decided to worship God despite his circumstances and feelings. We might say that this was indeed pure worship and greatly glorifying to God. He was at a very low point of his life. And we see, we can go back and talk about how David, when he was at the low point of his life, what did David do? He worshiped the Lord. Spurgeon said this, surely it has not come to this among God's people that we must do as we like, or else we will not praise him. If he does not please us every day and give way to our whims and gratify our taste, then we will not praise him. And as one author says, but think of how the devil reacted to this, hoping to hear Job blaspheme God. Well, what did the devil hear? He heard Job praise the Lord and worship God. Later in this, as we go through this book, we will read that spiritual battle is fought in and around Job consistently. He will seem to move very far from these words of worship, yet it is important to remember that a man's first reaction is often very telling. When we first hear the bad news, how do we initially react to it? Well, we see how Job reacted to it. We see how his heart initially reacted to this terrible news that he just received. How many of us would on our first reaction would worship God. So is there any questions or comments on any of that before we end for the day? All right. Well, we'll continue this next Sunday. If you bow your heads for me, close out in prayer. Heavenly Father, again, we're just grateful for the opportunity to be here this morning, Lord, and we just we ask, Lord, that to those that do not yet know you, Father, if they're in the congregation this morning, Lord, we just pray, Lord, that you just reveal to them the truth of who they are, the truth of who you are, and save them, Lord, for not for their glory, but for your glory alone. We pray that you're with Pastor Allen and David as they lead us in prayer and worship. And Lord, again, we're just grateful to be here. We're grateful for your word, and we worship you and give you all the glory. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.